Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. I've just noticed the cat is grooming himself right behind me. His name's Marley. Well, you've got a double of me this weekend because I posted a video just yesterday, so sorry about putting two on. But this is November's reading wrap-up. I've had a really good read based on World War November. If you took part, I hope you enjoyed it too. And also a reminder that tonight, as of the day this video is made, at 5 p.m. British time or 9 p.m. Pacific time, we're having the live chat between a group of us booktubers where we're going to discuss A Testament of Youth, which was the monthly read, and the other books we each decided to read. So without further ado, let's dig into this reading wrap-up. So the first book that I read in November, as part of World War November, I thought I'd revisit the great classic All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. Now, this is written from a soldier who came from the German side of the war. And what's so enlightening about that is how similar the German soldiers and the British soldiers were. And no doubt this went for the Italians, Austrians and Russians as well. You get the insights, the recognition, just how little the soldiers were actually interested in the war. They didn't see it as their war, but rather their government's war. But they felt an onus to stand before their country, to support the country. Dulce et decorum est, as Wilfred Owen would write the poem of later. But what we get in this story is the changing attitude of a young schoolboy who is promoted at school to join the war, how noble and heroic it is, and how his friends go out to war, and then their first experiences at the trenches, and then the horrors of warfare and the boredom of warfare. It's not all action like in films. The majority of the war is spent on sentry duty and waiting, the meagre rations. But then there are those moments of actual attack, actual defence, the constant bombardment of shells, horrendous scenes that these ones experience, and the very quick degrading of the human being and the human spirit. Some of the things that I found very interesting in this is when they go into no man's land on scouting expeditions or to cut the enemy barbed wire in readiness for an attack. And then obviously there's a little incident of fighting taking place inside one of the shell holes. And the way they dealt with each other and wounded men. It's a very vivid depiction. It's not furious, firesome writing, neither is it fully introspective, but it's very revealing. There are certain moments, the little things that happen, such as giving someone some gravy and them saying, "I shall never forget you for this." That's his friend Tjarden. He loves his food, and to get a bit of gravy is such a big thing in the trenches that he will never forget him for his life for just giving him that lovely, tasty food for a moment. One of the things that Remarque does so well, who could say it's remarkable, I'm so sorry, is he does capture those moments of realisation of the waste of a young generation. And I'll just read you one little comment that he made, and it gives you an idea of the writing, but also what it was like. Because although the narrator is not named in this book, it's an unknown German soldier, and it's not totally Erich Remarque's experiences, it's not autobiographical, it's semi-autobiographical. He's took things and put them into story form. And this is what he says: "We're no longer young men. We've lost any desire to conquer the world. We are refugees. We are fleeing from ourselves, from our lives. We were 18 years old and we had just begun to love the world and to love being in it, but we had to shoot at it. The first shell to land went straight for our hearts. We've been cut off from real action, from getting on, from progress. We don't believe in those things anymore. We believe in the war." There's a great sadness in that, isn't it? To hear a young person describe what the war had done to them. They'd been robbed of all the experiences and happiness of a normal youth. and everything became meaningless. They only believed in the war because that's all they knew. And there's so many poignant parts where he reflects on certain things, and when he reflects on even the British soldiers that he's fighting against, and the calling back and forth over no man's land to one another. An exceptionally good book. And in case you're worried that this, by the way, the recent film, is nothing like the book, like absolutely nothing like it. The cinematography is great, but it's not like the book. One thing that puts people off with this book is they think it's going to be large. It's not. It's about 200 pages, so you can get through it relatively quickly, but it is packed full of very thought-provoking sentences and paragraphs. The second book that I read in the month of November was the World War November read-along, which was A Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain, a nurse in the First World War. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It is a large book. It's coming in at around 600 pages. And it recounts her life from just before the war, living at home with her parents, and her ambitions to go to Oxford University, and the difficulties that entails for a girl to get into Oxford and be taken seriously because she wants to be a writer. Then into the war breaking out and her feeling the need to assist, to play her part in supporting the young soldiers. That's really what motivates her, is supporting the young soldiers. There's a very interesting, memorable scene shortly before the war when a lot of her friends who are boys, and her brother Edmund, or Edward, can't remember now, her love, the one she really likes, Roland, and their friend Geoffrey, they're all at a cadet school. They're about to be promoted as officers, young officer corps, and that's before the war, and she remembers how wonderful it was, how gay a time it was, and then how the war breaks it. Now, the reason it's called A Testament to Youth is because she constantly reflects on her brother, on Roland, her lover, and on Geoffrey and a couple of others in that close circle of friends who are all around the same age, who all get split up, who all get, the men get sent to the front, the young lads, and the letters that they write to each other. Vera Brittain kept a diary, a journal, and she wrote in it regularly, almost daily, and she takes excerpts of that to explain what she was thinking, what was going on at the time. But she also fills in with poems that were sent from, like Roland, the one whom she loved. He liked to write poetry. He didn't like really to publish it, but some of the poetry has her in it, like memories from before the war. And there's this brilliant love story that develops, which of course has been built into the film, which the image here, if it will focus, that's of the film itself, which is Alicia Vikander is on there. So it talks about all of that love. But the trials, the inward turmoil, the hardships of working in a hospital. She starts in a hospital in London. And so when the Battle of the Somme takes place and there's gas, and the first use of gas, there's a big influx into London of all these ones and how she has to go about it. And the way certain nurses behave, because she's not strictly a nurse, she's an assistant to the nurse corps. She gets moved to Malta. That was very interesting, and her descriptions of the time there, and the fact that the German U-boats were sinking hospital ships in that area. The one she arrived on, was it the Britannic, ended up being sunk like 2 weeks after she arrived at Malta on this. But the most moving part is her reflections on what takes place in the lives of the young men whom she's so affectionately tied to. And that's why the book is called A Testament of Youth. This was a lost generation. There was a sentence in this which really, really struck me because I'd never thought about it before. And maybe you have, or maybe you haven't. But by the end of the war, she said the first-rate academics and scholars of that generation have been lost, because they all fell out of college and university to go to war. When they were mercilessly laid low, It was only those who were a bit younger that sort of escaped the war, or there were some who were left over, but weren't necessarily the high-ranking scholars, the ones who passed the hardest test to get into uni, that actually survived and went back to university. And it struck me because, what insights into life, what technological advances were there that were lost to this world because of the slaughter. Remember, that's not just Britain. The slaughter of some of the best minds in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Russia, the United States, in the African continent. So much was lost. And some of the scenes are absolutely electrifying. Like when she's working on a hospital train, or when she's working in a hospital where the Germans are actually advancing on the salient, and they're really close, and they're told to evacuate, but a lot of the nurses decide they've got to stay to save the men. And then there's another passage where they're working on a train which is coming under being shelled, and it's just fantastic. This is such a good book. If you want something that gives you the sense of a real love story, a very deep sense of love that's not fiction, it could even break your heart to a degree. You may even cry. Read this book. Just a warning, you may not like Vera Brittain, especially at the beginning section of the book. The way she talks, you may think she's a little bit pompous, condescending, arrogant even, but she's being honest about how she was when she was young. And you see her change. One of the starkest things which hit me was her view, and the youth's view and the soldiers' view, of the government and the public and the press. How they really disliked them. They were quite happy sacrificing men to the war, the meat grinder. They were claiming nobility and all this kind of stuff and doing your duty. But when the war finishes, how these politicians very quickly start wrangling for personal gain, for national gain out of the war, when all these poor lads have been murdered brutally. All of the rhetoric counts for nothing. The real quality of some of the leaders comes out afterwards. Fantastic book. There's so much I could say because there's 600 pages and it's littered with great quotes, and nearly every chapter starts with a poem, which is really interesting to read through in relation to capturing the war, because some of the brightest literary scholars, it was in some respects a poet's war. Loads of the poets died during the war, but they captured the essence of it from the front lines. The next book that I read in November was also a prompt regarding World War November to read some other aspect of what was going on in the war. And the book that I got was The Courage of Cowards. I'll just show you that. This, you can see the white feather at the top. This is about conscientious objectors in the war. We often focus on the hospitals, we focus on the geopolitics, and we focus on the soldiers at the front. The conscientious objectors get overlooked an extraordinary amount. Of course, in their day they were called cowards, and many people still think anyone who conscientiously objects is a coward. They're running from the fighting and being killed. This short book, it's not the greatest book I've read historically, but nonetheless very insightful, very moving to see how brave you had to be to stand against the government and the entire public and the army of a whole militarized nation. Just think about that. It was terrible for the men going to the front, but at least they had massed ranks and guns. These men had to face some of the most atrocious consequences for not joining the war, and it was literally themselves against an entire country, unarmed as well. So just to remind myself, we got the accounts of a number of people, but there's Charles Dingle, Jack Foister, James Landers. Jack Foister was interesting because he resisted. He said out of conscience he couldn't join the war. And I think it was Foister, he was the one, he didn't reject based on moral grounds or religious grounds, but because he didn't agree with it in principle, and they hated him for that. Like, if you rejected on religious grounds, you could partly understand, the judges could, but political grounds, absolutely not. So saying, I'm not going into a war, which has been generated by, let's say, a few hundred people in Europe, which sacrificed, 18 million lives, they hated him for that. It's like, you can't politically take a stance. Do your country honour. Now, with Jack Foister, what was interesting, not only did he have a hard time in prison, but they shipped him out to France. There was a particular general on the war ministry. Now, he denied this later, but there's plenty of records to back this up. He shipped him out to France because conscientious objection, you couldn't face the death penalty for it. But that didn't apply in France. If he could send him and force him to join a regiment and then he refused, he could be court-martialed and shot. And so a whole group of men were sent out to France with that purpose in mind, to execute them. Now, it never came to actually executing them, but they were tortured. I think it was Foister. They were tied to a fence with their feet just touching the ground to give them some strength to hold up, and their arms spread out, and they were left for 12 hours. Then, the next day, the same thing was happened, but they were spread eagled, saltire, so, legs akimbo and arms akimbo, and just hung on a fence. And I think they left them for over 24 hours. They were in agony. And the comment was made that essentially we had a government saying, go and fight for your country, it is noble, and if you don't, we'll kill and torture you. And the irony in that, the gross hypocrisy, fight for the country that will torture you if you don't do what they say. That's sort of something that came across. You also have Charles Dingle. He ends up in the ambulance corps. That was his way of, he's sort of in a dilemma. He didn't want to fight. He did not agree with fighting, but maybe you could join the ambulance corps. Now, some objectors didn't like this because the ambulance corps is supporting the war in their mind. Charles Dingle and others, they thought, well, I'm not killing, what I'm doing is saving lives. I wouldn't work to build munitions, for instance, but would go and save injured people. And he ends up caught in some of their most vicious fighting. I think he's on a hospital train as well. And that was fascinating. And the last one, James Landers, he's a pacifist, a Christian pacifist. And it just says here, his dilemma is to stick to his principles and face prison or join the non-combatant corps and financially support his family. Now, this is interesting. He has a mother who relies on him. She had fallen to prostitution at times and drunkenness. And he knew if he didn't bring in an income, his mother was going to fail. She totally depended on him. And so what does he do? He couldn't, in his Christian conscience, kill other men. He took that, thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. And Jesus saying, those who take up the sword die by the sword. So that was his argument. But he needed to provide money. So he joined the non-combatant corps. And they sort of did some work around the country. Now, there's recounting of how they set up these camps for these ones. And they would say you can get out of prison this way. But the camps were deliberately designed to break conscientious objectors. They slept in boggy marshes with tents that leaked, that weren't wax-proofed. They got pneumonia. And then they went out of the day smashing stones and making gravel. And even the commission to inspect it said that they are being treated appallingly, that you could even argue that they had a much worse time than the men at the front, and that this was designed to kill them. It actually was thought of as designed to kill conscientious objectors. And so imagine that. That takes incredible courage, as well as the population hating you because they think of you as a coward because you're not being shot or you're not in uniform. That was the other thing. Someone could sign up for the army and not be called up to the front and wear a uniform and be praised. These couldn't wear a uniform and so were constantly mocked by and attacked, viciously attacked by people, especially women, who you can understand they're losing their loved ones in the war. But it's one of those things about how people don't choose to see other sides. They're not aware of what others are going through. It was a really good book, and I will be reading more about conscientious objectors from World War I. The fourth book that I read in November was The Painted Veil by Somerset Maugham. This was the book we were discussing in my Patreon group, and almost universally loved amongst all of the members there. What a brilliant story. Somerset Maugham is fantastic on drawing characters. He's fantastic on the way they think and alter there's the development. The character arc is very strong, with Somerset Maugham. And he was one of the most popular writers of the 20s and 30s and remains popular today. He's also got a very brisk way of writing. His chapters are like 1 page to 2.5 pages long. He's an expert at keeping momentum going. But the story itself follows Kitty Fane, who marries because her sister's going to get married before her. She marries this bacteriologist called Walter Fane, who's a really nice guy who dotes on her, but she doesn't really find him attractive. But she marries him anyway. And they move out to Hong Kong. Now, while she's out in Hong Kong, she's part of the set, and she likes all of the socializing and looking good, and she used to love it when the boys courted her. And it starts off with an adulterous liaison going on. In fact, the first chapter is fantastic for building tension. And she likes this guy called Charles, and Walter basically says, I'm going to divorce you because of this affair, or you can come with me to China where I'm going to help with a cholera epidemic. And she says, but we'll die there. He says, not necessarily, but he says, otherwise I'm divorcing you and I'll be naming the man you're with. And she talks to her lover and he says, oh, you better go with him. Now she thinks this lover loves her and would marry her, divorce his own wife, but Walter knows full well he's not that kind of character. And so she ends up in China with Walter, facing a cholera epidemic and being face to face with the suffering, being in a different culture, isolated from the Western culture and the set. She begins to notice different things. She begins to be aware of other people's opinions, of other people's observations. She confronts mortality. She gets mixed up with a convent. She doesn't become a nun, but she helps with caring for people. And the whole story, no, I'm not going to spoil it. I explain in Patreon, I do an in-depth review and explain where Maugham got the idea for the story, and that itself is fascinating. It was such a good idea for a story, which goes right back to Dante's Purgatorio. But the development of her character, she's certainly not a lovable character at the beginning, but the way she develops is wonderful, and the way Walter develops is wonderful. And the interesting characters that come along, Waddington and the Manchu Princess. It's a fabulous book, swift moving, 220 pages long maybe, but packed. I mean, this is a book as an example of not a word wasted. If you want to, in my opinion, if you want to read excellent writing, vivid, not vivid, swift moving and evocative, more poetic than Hemingway. But if you think of Hemingway being sparse on his words to accomplish an end, Maugham does that, but is more poetic, more feeling, and less hardcore masculine than Hemingway. He's a brilliant writer if you've never experienced him before. If you like this book, you have a whole slew of his works to get through, which you'll be thrilled with. Now, the fifth piece of literature that I read in November, I can't really say it's one book. I was looking into poetry from World War I because so many great poets wrote during World War I. And there was a change of sentiment through the war in how the poets were expressing themselves. And that in itself was very enlightening to see how young men set off into the war, their ambitions, their aims, what the war stood for, and then watching it change. The longer the war ground on until it completely broke the spirit of, an entire generation. You see it happening. And all the way through the war, you see this in Testament of Youth, the soldiers, and in All Quiet on the Western Front, the soldiers couldn't stand the civilian population's attitude towards the war. They didn't know what it was like. They talked about it. Only people that talked about the war being glorious, noble, wonderful, doing your duty, were politicians who didn't have to get involved, academics who didn't have to get involved, and the public that didn't have to get involved. They're the ones that thought it was wonderful. Hardly any, I won't say no soldier didn't feel it was noble. Ernst Junger from Storm of Steel certainly did. and I'm sure there were a couple, but the majority, vast majority of men hated the war. They hated other people's view of it who weren't involved because they just didn't know, and they found it repulsive. So reading the poetry was very interesting. Now, I'll just read you two very short poems which capture this. They're famous poems, actually, but this is just to give you an idea of how poetry changed. So, first of all, we have the great poet Rupert Brooke. Potentially the greatest poet that was going to be of his day. And he wrote The Soldier. You may have heard this. There's a certain tragedy in the words, but actually listen for the glorying of the war. To die for one's country. It's dulce et decorum est pro patria. It means it is a great and noble thing to die for one's country. It's a Latin phrase. It goes right back into antiquity. And Rupert Brooke sort of captured the nobility, the pathetic nobility of the war. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by the sons of home. And think this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness in hearts apiece under an English heaven. There's something so transcendent about that, so glorious about it. Moving as well when you consider that soldiers would die, but wherever they die, in some foreign field, there is a patch of earth that is forever England. How great, how noble. Of course, Rupert Brooke died on his way to the Gallipoli attack in Turkey on board one of the ships, the transport ships, in 1917. But his works, the public lapped them up. And so did the young men who thought that going to war still, when he wrote this, which was in the early days of the war, was a great thing. However, there is a response to this by the poet Wilfred Owen much later in the war, another young poet, where the nobility of war has been stripped of its facade. That it's actually ugly and dirty, it's brown and muddy and gruesome and has no nobility nor respect to it whatsoever. That is genuinely, if you read a lot of these memoirs, that's how most of them felt. And actually Wilfred Owen names his title Dulce et Decorum Est. It is noble and great, pro patria, to die for one's country. Now listen to what he says in his poem. He's fought at the front, and sadly he died in 1918, just before the war ended. But listen to this description of war in poetry. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Isn't that fantastic? He's describing the gassing of an individual and how he's drowning, he's clawing at the air, a green sea because of the green chlorine gas, and how every jolt on the wagon coughs blood up for him. And if you knew these things, you wouldn't speak with zest about the glory, pro patria mori, to die for one's country. You wouldn't say it. That is a response to the civilian and governmental attitudes to war as espoused by Rupert Brooke in The Soldier. It's not glorious. And I've read a lot more poems which are all fantastic. I may actually do an entire video on different poems from the war. Would you like that? Leave a comment down below. Genuinely, would you watch it? But also, Vera Brittain was great because loads of poems going on in there as well. So that was my reading for the month. Again, a reminder, at British time, 5 p.m. today, or 9 a.m. Pacific time, we're going to have a discussion all together, 4 of us, all about the books that we read, but specifically Testament of Youth. And if you read that, you may want to tune in and just listen to a little chat, a little discussion that's going on about it. Feel free to let me know what you read in the month as well. And if you appreciate my channel, you can support it by going to my Patreon and getting exclusive content. Or if you just want to make a small contribution of like £3, you can go to my Buy Me a Coffee link, which is put down below. I appreciate so much the support you have all given me this year. It's been a fantastic year, and I put it all down to you, the growth that I've had. And I appreciate your comments. I read them all, but of course I get hundreds. And so I can't respond to them all. Sorry about that. I'd love to, but the time that takes is like a full-time job. So anyway, thank you for supporting me, and I will see you next time. And until then, I wish you joy in whatever you read.